Along the windswept coast of early medieval Wales, where cliffs rise above a restless sea, the story of a saint begins not in cathedral stone, but in exposure and endurance. Before David would be remembered as patron of a nation, his first foundation was laid in the suffering of his mother, Nonnita. Tradition does not preserve her life in abundance of detail, yet what remains is stark and powerful. It speaks of vulnerability, of violence endured, and of childbirth beneath a raging storm. Sanctity, in this account, does not emerge from comfort, but from trial. When lightning split the rock at the moment of birth, memory transformed that storm into symbol. The child would one day steady the faith of Wales, yet his first witness was a woman who endured pain without renouncing dignity. Nonnita, also remembered as was the daughter of Sinner of Caergog in Pembrokeshire. Though born into a family of standing, her life would not unfold in security. Medieval tradition portrays her not as a figure of privilege, but as a woman whose strength was forged through suffering rather than comfort. The father of David is identified in later accounts as Sant or Sanctus, sometimes interpreted as a local ruler of Ceredigion. Yet the memory preserved in Christian tradition emphasizes not political alliance, but coercion. David's conception is described as the result of violence, marking the beginning of the story with injustice endured. This detail, uncomfortable yet unsoftened by the sources, frames Nonnita's motherhood within trial rather than romance. Sanctity in this narrative does not arise from ideal circumstances. It is born from endurance under conditions that could have crushed resolve. When the time of childbirth arrived, Nonnita was upon a coastal cliff overlooking the sea. A violent storm swept across the Welsh shore. Wind roared against the rocks, and thunder echoed over the waters as she labored alone. In the intensity of pain, she grasped a stone beside her so firmly that, according to tradition, her fingers left marks upon its surface. At the moment of David's birth, lightning struck and split the rock in two, as if the storm itself bore witness. Those fractured stones entered sacred memory. Later generations believed they became foundational elements for St. David's Cathedral and St. Nong's Chapel. What began in isolation and anguish was remembered as the first visible sign of a life destined for spiritual leadership. After the storm and the birth upon the cliff, Nonnita did not retreat into obscurity. Tradition holds that she raised her son in Lannan, a village later associated with her name, in a land still marked by pagan remnants and fragile Christian communities. The task of forming a child in faith required vigilance and constancy. The early Welsh church was austere, missionary in spirit, and shaped by monastic discipline. David would later become a reformer and ascetic, but such inclinations do not arise without early formation. His mother's example likely impressed upon him reverence, restraint, and endurance. Though sources are sparse, her role as mother stands central. She did not merely give birth to a future bishop. She sustained him through infancy and childhood in a coastal region often harsh in climate and limited in resources. Faith was not theoretical, but lived in daily hardship. In the memory of Welsh Christianity, Nonnita is not described as passive. She is remembered as devout and resilient, a woman whose suffering did not turn into bitterness. Instead, it became discipline. The environment in which David was raised was simple and rural. There were no courts of influence, no elaborate schools of rhetoric. The foundations of his later leadership were shaped by prayer, humility, and the rhythms of agrarian life. Her identity as a mother carried theological weight. Medieval hagiography often emphasizes divine signs surrounding saints. Yet it equally recognizes the formative influence of mothers whose faith anchors early development. The village associated with her name became a place of remembrance. Lannon, linked to Nonnita, stood not as monument to power, but as testimony that sanctity often germinates in hidden households. As David matured and moved toward monastic formation, the imprint of his upbringing remained. The humility later attributed to him echoes the quiet endurance of the woman who first bore him into the world. Before David became patron of Wales, he was a child shaped by a mother who had already endured storm and scandal. In Nonnita's perseverance, the seed of future sanctity was protected and nurtured. As David grew and entered his own monastic path, tradition records that Nonnita did not remain confined to one place. Her life, already marked by movement and endurance, continued along the western shores of Britain, reflecting the missionary fluidity of the early Celtic Church. She is said to have traveled to Cornwall, a region closely connected to Wales through maritime routes and shared Christian heritage. Such movement was not unusual in the early medieval period, when saints, monks, and widows often crossed waters in search of quiet devotion. In Cornwall, devotion to her memory later took root, suggesting that her presence left a spiritual impression. Wells and chapels associated with her name emerged in later centuries, linking landscape to sanctity in the Celtic tradition. The motif of holy wells, so common in early British Christianity, reflects continuity between land, memory, and prayer. Just as David's birth was marked by rock and lightning, Nonnita's later remembrance became tied to water and pilgrimage. Eventually, tradition holds that she ended her days in Brittany, in a convent shaped by the same Celtic currents that flowed through Wales and Cornwall. There, removed from the storm of her youth, she entered a quieter rhythm of devotion. Her final years are not described with dramatic visions or miraculous signs. Instead, they are framed in stability and prayer, suggesting that endurance, rather than spectacle, defined her sanctity. Unlike her son, whose episcopate would shape a nation's memory, Nonnita's legacy rests in quieter foundations. She did not govern dioceses or reform monasteries. She formed a saint. The chapel at Capel Naun in South Wales stands as a geographic reminder of her story. The cliff, the storm, and the stone remain part of sacred landscape, binding memory to place. In Nonnita, the Church remembers not public authority, but maternal resilience. Her life affirms that sanctity can begin in suffering, endure through obscurity, and conclude in prayer far from acclaim. The historical record does not preserve a detailed account of Nonnita's death. No martyrdom is described, no final vision recorded, and no dramatic illness narrated in surviving tradition. The sources simply indicate that she ended her days within a Breton convent, in prayer and quiet devotion. Her departure from this world is marked not by spectacle, but by silence, consistent with a life remembered more for endurance than for public acclaim. Saint Nonnita does not stand in history as a reformer, bishop, or miracle worker. Her name survives because she bore one who would become a pillar of the Welsh Church. Yet her sanctity does not depend on borrowed glory. It rests in endurance, in quiet faithfulness, and in the dignity preserved amid injustice. Her story begins with violence and storm, but it does not end in bitterness. It unfolds through perseverance, maternal devotion, and a life carried across coasts and cultures. She teaches that the Church is not built only through public ministry, but through hidden formation. Before David steadied a nation, a mother steadied him. In remembering Nonnita, we remember that behind many saints stands a quiet strength that history often overlooks. Through her prayers, may we learn that faithfulness in obscurity is not lesser glory, but deeper foundation.